I'm thrilled to be sitting up here beside the founding CEO of Foundation Fast, an angel investor, an entrepreneur, and an innovation architect. And there's a lot of things that we could talk about when it comes to regulating big technologies and AI global governance. Of course, AI is a very broad topic. It's more of a field, and there's a lot of different areas we could go with this. But to kind of kick it off, I'd like to take you back to your time working for the UN as a commissioner for the UN Broadband Initiative and being involved in a substantial multilateral organization. What do you think is the role of multilateral institutions when it comes to advancing technology and regulating it, let's say?
Well,
easy first question. Welcome.
Right. Thank you, Heather. It's great to be here and be amongst friends. I'm an alum from 2008. Thank you. All right. Back to square one. 2008 alums. So it's been 12 years now that we've been doing this. This has been great, and I think every year this initiative is getting better. I'm glad to be here in this seat. Speaking about what we were discussing when I was a commissioner at the United Nations Broadband Commission, you know, I think infrastructure is one of the critical things that multilateral institutions and multinational companies can get involved. In 2012, when I joined Broadband Commission, 5G was already a technology of past, although none of it was deployed yet. But we were at the commission discussing what 6G technology is going to be, and that was something very important. Why? Because we knew that 5G, for instance, 5G technology is not going to fully support autonomous vehicles because it has a latency. So we were talking about, and Huawei, the chairman, CEO of Huawei was also a commissioner, and they were ahead of, and now, you know, when it comes to deployment, Huawei is so far ahead than many other organizations. So this is 7 years ago, and they already had so much investments done in 5G technology. They were already thinking, starting a lab that starts working on a 6th generation. Only now I saw a piece, I think, about a month ago or so, another entity was thinking about 6G, but this was the discussions that were taking place 7 years ago. And I think for multinationals, thinking about structural changes, thinking about infrastructure is very critical for them to be involved in that. You know, any type of an ecosystem, when it comes to socioeconomic ecosystems, there are three things, actually four things, but three things we can speak about that are always there. It's communication, energy, and technology. These three things are always there. It doesn't matter what type of an ecosystem you're speaking about. And the fourth is policy, regulations, essentially. So big multinationals discussing, you know, how to get the best communication system in, and that's what we're talking about, 5G or 6G. Then transportation, and then energy, you know, going from fossil fuels to smart or renewables. Those are the stuff I think multinational entities should speak about and you know, kind of design new policies, new structures where entrepreneurs and startups could come in and come up with actual solutions.
Fantastic. So switching gears completely to the other topic, which involves artificial intelligence. You have done a lot of work in this space. You've heard a lot of people talk about it. I'm curious from your perspective, what's one of the biggest misconceptions that you think is floating around with regards to artificial intelligence?
I'll name two. One, everyone thinks anything automated is artificial intelligence. You hear so many startups now talk about artificial intelligence. Just walk in, throw that term, AI this, AI that. So anything that, you know, it's like directional. It's like having a calculator or a microwave, calling it artificial intelligence. It's no different. There are few things that have intelligence. You want when it comes to artificial intelligence, you want some kind of a technology to have some sort of learning, albeit it could be through guidance of a human, but some sort of learning and then educating you, and in some ways that you would otherwise not be educated. there are very few technologies. You know, I would want to say what DeepMind is doing, Google's DeepMind out of UK. This is probably the closest you can get to an actual artificial intelligence. Otherwise, you know, anything directional. Essentially, you already told it something, and then you ask a question, it replies from something you've told it. So it's like speaking to yourself, but much faster when it comes to current, what you would call AI. So that kind of, you know, it dilutes the importance of AI, and AI actually in healthcare, in medicine, in transportation, in energy could be useful, could do so much. But because you have so much noise, people invest randomly, and those of you who are investors here, you probably go through this all the time when people come in and give you these absurd pitches about, you know, what AI is. I think that creates a noise and an uncomfortable one. So it doesn't allow many of the right smart investments to be done properly. The second part is when we talk about that artificial intelligence is going to kill us off. There is certain truth to that, naturally. But to be honest with you, I am more concerned about dumb humans than smart machines. And you know what's happening, you know, the spectacle in Washington, D.C. that's happening now. So, look, there's two paths to AI on a serious note. If we work with solutions in artificial intelligence and it becomes independent of us, I think we may have an issue. But if we work with technology and it becomes part of us, I think we're on a better and a right path. And it is my take that we are working with artificial intelligence to be part of us. Why? Because there is a lot of interest for us, whether it comes to longevity, living healthy, and we're trying to apply these types of technologies to help us kind of live longer, live healthier, live better. Because of that particular dynamic, what it means for technology for us as human, as species, I think the conversion of technology into us, and we're doing that, you know, whether it's, you know, you're changing your kneecaps or your, you know, valves, you know, we're integrating technologies into us. We just don't feel it, don't think of it that way. But I question every one of you. If I say, you know, if you have someone's information on hand, and whether you have it yourself, you would say, you know, if I say, do you know this person's email or phone number, you would say, absolutely, I do. And then when I ask you, I say, all right, so give it back to me. You're going to go immediately to your smartphone and start looking for that. You actually don't have it. You don't retain that information yourself, but you have outsourced it to another entity that you feel it's yours, but you feel you have it. So now you already have something that is not you, that has information that is yours, but you as a human species, you actually don't have access to that information yourself. Because if I wipe your phone out, you're done, you just don't have it. So we're moving in that direction, that's what I'm trying to say. It's just, you know, this is progress, it's like watching your nails grow. You're never going to see it happen, and it just happens to you. And I think as long as we continue on that path, we should be safer. But again, I'll take smart machines over dumb humans any day.
Something that's infinite, you know, human stupidity. Anyway, you were touching on this a little bit, but about the information that you outsource to something like a smartphone. It's another piece of data that we create, and there's no shortage of discussions about data. It's something we want to get into talking about today. So my question for you are just kind of what assumptions can people in this room make from your perspective on how their personal data is protected? A smile.
The question is going to be, is you a king? Yes, you heard me correctly. Is you the king? Look, if we go back to tribal society, the chief had all of your data. You were nobody. A human had no individual possession. Your wife was chief's possession anytime the chief decided that he wants your wife to be your possession. Your child is chief's soldier anytime the chief decides your child is this. If you go to kingdoms, the same thing. If you go to monarchy, feudal order, the same thing. The king owns all of your information. It is only the past 100 years, really, that we have this glimpse of individualism, that we say, you know what, all of a sudden I have information that is mine. And you really have to question whether this is just part of in human evolution, the small part, 50 years, 100 years, that we actually have access to information that is only us protected, it's only for us, or it's just a period where the protection of, or what a human species would say, my information will just come in and very quickly expire and move away from it. Now, are we shifting away? The reason I started with "Is you the king?" is because are we shifting away from community to individualism, and the individual becomes the king? Because the only way for you to protect the information if you are your own king. And that's the question we really need to ask and really try to reply if that's the case. And I want to say, as sophisticated hacking and other abuse comes of data, there's going to be an exchange of part of your sovereignty for security, same way nation states do. Nation states, and on some occasions, they give part of their sovereignty to gain security. And I think for us, we're going to get to a point where, you know, what is your passport? Most of your passport starts with the word password, guys. Let's not kid ourselves. So anyone that wants to really hack you, they can do it in minutes, if not seconds. So your data is never really protected. But my point is, as the hacking gets really sophisticated and they need individual data or for 7.5 billion people, you may actually come to an understanding that I am not the king. I rather have one and live in peace or live in security by giving some of my sovereignty. So it's not really a controversial question. It's actually an awareness, the question of awareness of what protection means when it comes to information that you feel or you think is yours.
So while we meditate on thinking about whether or not we is the king, I'd like to welcome two members of the class of 2019 also to come up. Please give them a round of applause, both to Armen and to your two classmates. There are two mics here as well. Please pick one up on your way up. Fantastic. So how this is going to go, I have a question prepared for Megha and a question prepared for Nikhil, and then we'll open the floor to the rest of the audience for any questions that you have. So broad topic, could go in a lot of different places. We're excited to see where it's going to go. And keeping with tradition of introducing people via their Twitter bios, which is also a subtle reminder that you could be tweeting about Asia 21. Crazy, I know. In fact, you can see it right there, that at Asia 21 leaders, wow, if you tweeted that, that's connected to what we're doing right now. Isn't that crazy? Crazy. So, on the far end, of course, we have Megha, an international correspondent at BuzzFeed News, ex-Beijing and Bangkok, light packer. You can direct message her for Signal. And I'd also like to highlight that our colleague, of course, speaks Mandarin and has lived in China for about 7 years. Beside her, Nikhil, founder at Medianama, a TED Fellow at Asia 21 Leaders. Wow, put it into his Twitter bio, pretty fantastic. And co-founder of Save the Internet at Internet Freedom. He also has a quote in Hindi, which I do not speak, so I will say it in English. But it basically says, if you fly a kite and it gets cut, don't feel sad about it. So to kick it off on the end, Megha, biometrics, big topic. Also connected to data and a pretty major thing that many nations are getting involved with when it comes to trying to keep control, perhaps, or better understand the flow of their security within a sovereign nation, let's say. So it would be really interesting, I think, if you could share a little bit with the audience about some of the trends that you've seen in how different groups who are in power are making use of biometrics, be that through facial recognition or other areas.
It's okay. That is, in fact, a huge subject. I'll try to do it justice in a very short amount of time. So I guess for the purposes of this discussion, we could define biometric surveillance as any kind of collection of information about personal traits. And some of this is very old technology that does not use AI, like things like fingerprint collection and stuff like that. And some of it is newer stuff like gait recognition, analysis of crowds and that sort of stuff that's done on top of video feeds in an automated fashion. So I'll sort of focus on facial recognition because I think that's what it's been on a lot of people's minds recently, especially here in the States. So to my mind, the earliest kind of known use of facial recognition technology by law enforcement was actually in a suburb of Tampa in 2001. So it was quite a long time ago. And the police rolled it out. They were sort of given a semi-critical write-up by the New York Times, and then a year later, they got rid of it and said that it hadn't helped them catch a single criminal. So we've come a long way since then. I started reporting on biometric surveillance and facial recognition technology sort of as a consequence of some of my work in China. I spent a lot of time out in the west of China reporting on the kind of surveillance measures that are being used to target Muslim minorities there, particularly Uyghur minorities. And the thing that's remarkable about what's happening there is that it's not just facial recognition technology, but it's sort of a lot of different forms of surveillance, that have created sort of pools of data about individuals that are then brought together and sort of synthesized. And, this can include anything from like your electricity use, your movement patterns, like whether you go outside of your town to a different town, whether you're married, whether anyone's pregnant in your household, your job, whether you've made phone calls abroad, like all these kind of little things about you, go into this kind of centralized database. And Human Rights Watch and others have documented that this kind of body of evidence against you can be used to detain you if you belong to a minority group. So to me, like kind of having seen this and experienced it, and having interviewed a lot of people who have sort of lived in that system, it sort of made me see this technology from the other side, the way that it can be used against very vulnerable groups of people. And I started to sort of look into the companies that were building this technology and sort of where they were marketing it and where they were selling it. And there was, of course, a number of very successful big Chinese companies ranging from Hikvision, which is the world's largest maker of surveillance cameras, to SenseTime, to Tencent that are making some of this technology. There's a number of American companies, including Microsoft. HP is another one, I believe. There's Japanese companies, there's Israeli companies, and by and large, this technology is like pretty much unregulated. And when I started going to like trade shows and things like that in the Middle East, I found that these companies were marketing the same sort of technology to all kinds of governments. Places like Egypt, which has like a really long history of cracking down on unrest. I wanted to also say a quick word about how facial recognition works. I think this probably will not be news to some of you in the audience, but maybe some of you will benefit from it. I think a lot of people, when they think about facial recognition, they think about that thing that happens at the airport where you put your passport down and it pulls up a picture of you. And that's actually kind of a dated vision of how it works. The way it works is if you have like a very high quality video feed, the facial recognition will actually sort of capture images of you from different angles. So maybe you go to a coffee shop every day, and one day you have a ponytail on, or you're wearing a baseball cap, or one day you're wearing makeup, and the next day you're not. So over time, it can capture lots of different images of you, also like looking in kind of different directions, and sort of figure out what you look like from a 3D model kind of perspective. And in this way, these products are really good at parsing like thousands of hours of video footage and finding individuals. So the last thing I want to say, there's 2 points I want to make about, like, why is this significant? Why should we care? So from a privacy standpoint, I think like all of us in this room are quite tech savvy, and on our devices, if we want to say something that we don't really, we want to keep private or something, we might use an encrypted app. We might just wait to see our friend in person and say it to them in person. But I mean, the thing that's remarkable about that is that in a pretty short space of time, we've all sort of accepted as a society that these things are not private. They're not good for privacy, right? So we've sort of surrendered our privacy on these in a big way. So then what happens if you take that equation and then apply it to physical space, right? Like what if, where I go in the morning is also something that I'm worried is not completely private. So obviously this matters to people like journalists and activists and stuff like that, but it also matters to anybody who is, maybe going to a therapy appointment. Maybe you're going to get birth control. Like we all do a million things in our lives that we don't necessarily want people to know about. And the second point I want to make is that I genuinely think that biometric surveillance is kind of a world-changing thing, and I think it's because that, of all the kind of like activists and protesters like I've interviewed in my life as a journalist, like most of them are not people who are really okay with going to jail or paying like a really high cost for the work that they're doing. Most of them are ordinary people who have spouses and jobs and families, and they want to participate in political life in their countries, even if they are, in a pretty repressive environment or a closed environment. So then when you add something like facial recognition or other forms of surveillance in physical spaces to this equation, you really radically raise the cost for that person to go out and demonstrate. So all of these kinds of collective action that have brought about things like democratization and reforms and other kind of good things that we want to see in the world, the structure of those movements is going to change quite a bit because of this.
Thank you. Switching gears yet again. Nikhil, internet sovereignty. Let's talk about it. What's happening?
So before I get to that, I wanted to respond to something that Armen said. And so I refuse to accept the notion that we're not kings, that we don't have rights over our own bodies, that we don't have rights over our own data. The last 200 years of democracy and individual rights being given to people, there's a lot of work that's been done by the generations that have preceded us, and it is on our generation to do the work to maintain and retain those rights, even though technology today is in a position where it is taking it away from us. So whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's facial recognition, there is a global market failure in privacy. There is no doubt about that. But it is on us to create the norms, the systems, the structures, the conversations, the stories, the groundwork, the coming together of people to ensure that our rights are protected and they remain. We cannot give up on this. And I think it's important for us to recognize that there are countries where rights are fewer. There are countries where we have stronger rights. And we have to propagate the message of the right values. We have international human rights for a reason. We have a fundamental right to privacy for a reason. And there is much work ahead of us, and it's becoming tougher. But I have no doubt that with time, we will prevail on these issues. Right? So I just wanted to put that out there, that we have rights and we are kings of ourselves, maybe not of our countries. And I know that there is a sort of authoritarianism regime that's coming in that's using technology, but democracy must prevail. So and I think I just segue into that idea of internet sovereignty. I want us to suspend our judgments for a bit and imagine Facebook as a country, imagine Google as a country, imagine large platforms with over 1 billion users and the ability to manipulate the democratic process and the power that they wield on us today, right? And if you are a country looking at this situation, if you look back at the Arab Spring and the impact that the Arab Spring had, many people in the democratic world welcomed it. But imagine what it did to a particular country, even if it was a democratic country. It's about retaining control over your dominion, over your own sovereignty. So with more and more data being collected, with the ability to manipulate the voting process, countries have now started looking at what they can do to protect themselves. And the sovereignty question, the protectionism issue is coming about because of the power that the platforms yield. We are today dependent on the benevolence of platform to not subvert our democracies. And so we need rules of the road in place to protect, to prevent misuse of the platforms, misuse by the platforms. It's happened in the US, it's probably happened in India, it's happening in multiple parts of the world. And there are other issues, for example, like what the internet and safe harbor has given us is this ability to bring massive amount of consumer value at large scale. But it's also led to the gig economy and the effective manipulation and squeezing of labor from workers, to the point that, at least from what I know in India, there have been drivers who've become suicidal because they can't pay the debt that they've taken when the incentives were high, because the platforms are playing an infinite game, whereas the drivers are playing a day-to-day game. So there is need to protect citizens, there's need to protect workers in different parts of the world. And so there are two angles to this. One is a geopolitical angle where you have to protect the sovereignty of each country, and the other is a local angle or an on-ground angle where you have to protect the rights of people. Governments are looking at various mechanisms to do this. Chief amongst them is the control over data. So the prevention of cross-border data flows, the forcing of data localization from large platforms, because governments feel that if they control the data in a particular jurisdiction, they can get access to it for security. Platforms or governments that control those platforms cannot destabilize economies by shutting them off. There are methods the rules that need to be made for consumer protection. There are rules that need to be made for preventing vertical integration and the increased accumulation of power. The framework to look at these relationships is power, whether it is between a consumer and a platform. If you've taken an Uber ride and the driver's had an accident or been driving really badly, how does Uber compensate you? For Uber, both you and the driver have equal rights. I got a response saying that the drivers, so their privacy regulations don't allow them to tell me how they punish the driver that had driven rashly, right? So these are not easy questions. There are no easy answers here. But the impact that it is having is that every country is looking to see how it can protect itself and its own citizens, and effectively balkanize the internet by keeping data locally, by preventing cross-border data flows. So every country in the world will have a separate internet. You'll have your own set of sites. Local businesses are using this situation to try and push back against global companies. And the global internet is under threat. We'll see this play out over the next few years. Different jurisdictions, different countries, the national boundaries are being used to launch cyber attacks and for cyber warfare on other countries. India just had an attack on a new nuclear power plant, allegedly from North Korea. And attribution is a very difficult part of cyber attacks. So we have to find the rules of the road. We have to find the norms at a global level, almost like a digital Geneva Convention, to figure out what can be done and what should be prevented. What are the norms for platforms to operate? What are the norms for countries to operate? And I think we're just beginning that process now.
So one more quick question before we open it up to the audience, and this is for everybody on the panel. We'll start at the end with Megha. Tech, good, bad, or neutral? Ooh.
So I forced Heather to ask this question, but I guess I think don't
tell them that. It was so smooth.
Essentially, to set me up to say that I think that framing is often used and is generally probably too simplistic. But I mean, I get frequently accused of being a techno-pessimist, which I don't think I am. Like, obviously tech has many beneficial uses for society. It should go without saying. But I think that, Something I've noticed is that this notion that tech is neutral, that tech can be used for good or bad, is often used by the makers of tech and people who sell technology to sort of disengage from the eventual use of that technology. And I think that can be pretty harmful. So I'll talk about China again. There's a really obvious example of this, which is DNA sequencing technology that was sold to Chinese government authorities by a company called Thermo Fisher, which is a leading player in DNA. And this kind of technology obviously has beneficial impacts. It can help governments learn more about their populations to manage the spread of hereditary diseases. It has lots of kind of research uses. But in this particular case, it was being used in a really problematic way because the government is sort of gathering DNA as part of this kind of surveillance push from ethnic minorities. And in a situation like that, there's a lot of questions around what consent means. Are people really consenting to have their DNA taken? And it's not a China-specific issue. I mean, it's sort of being used in that way it's sort of a more extreme case in China, but there are lots of countries right now that are trying to set up basically national DNA databases. And that raises lots of questions around consent. How do you monitor who is actually giving up this information under duress? Are people educated enough about the real implications of it? And then what about all their family members? Their family members didn't consent. So there's all of these kinds of ethical questions there. And I think, Nikhil and I were talking about this before, but the really classic example is, all of the impacts of social media that we've seen over the past 2 years and the links between social media and communal violence in really fragile places like Sri Lanka and India and Myanmar. I think tech companies are sort of realizing that some of these issues are genuine problems that they need to grapple with. But, I come from a family of engineers, and what I hear from engineers often is, I built this thing. It's a cool product. It can be used for good things, and I put it out into the world, and that's it. That's sort of what my job is. And I can understand that. Because that's sort of how it's always been. But I think that in my mind, there needs to be some kind of philosophical change there, where people who make things, scientists, researchers, engineers, need to start thinking about the ethical implications of these products sort of from the beginning, maybe even in a systematic way, because often, by the time it gets to the end user, in some cases, the end user can be an authoritarian government, and by then it can be too late.
So I'm seeing this as more of a safe harbor question. If you think about it, so I'll give you an example in terms of where it's been used badly. The first mob lynching that happened in India using WhatsApp as a platform, where there was a fake video that was circulated related to a rape in a particular community, which led to number of deaths, was in 2013. It took till 2018, when the Indian government was threatening to ban WhatsApp or put someone in their office in jail, for WhatsApp to actually make changes to the platform to reduce the velocity with which messages were being sent. So I do think that there is a gap in terms of how platforms operate, in terms of the gap between when they realize there's a problem and how long they can let it stretch. Airbnb is a classic example. Uber is another one where they've let things happen and only dealt with it when regulation was upon them, or there was a serious number of issues that aggregated together, or there was a court case that was filed by someone. So platforms have invariably allowed the lack of, or the protection that they get from safe harbor to let things pass and to let things happen and not take any of the responsibility. So from a regulation perspective, there's a gap between the responsibility and the accountability of platforms. That gap is safe harbor. And safe harbor is going to go in the next 2 years, or it's going to get diluted very quickly, which then is going to impact the growth of the internet. Now, you can say that tech can be used for good, it can be used for bad, and it's just a tool. And when you look at it from that perspective, what's the responsibility of a platform? And I think we have to define that there are certain things which tech companies simply cannot do or should not do in the interest of human rights. And we have to go about defining those things. So I think I mean, just my view, a large part of the problems that the world is facing when it comes to privacy is because of the lack of regulation of data brokers. That has led to mass accumulation of data by large platforms, which have allowed the platforms to be misused. Twitter's ban on political advertising is a great talking point, and I'm glad that the world is having this debate now. Should it be okay? Should it not be okay? There are many such debates which we need to have, because it's the tech. I mean, if my issue with biometrics really is that it's permanent. It's like having a permanent username and password, both together with your face, with your fingerprints. And the fact is that you can take a high-resolution photograph of me over here and then replicate that in a manner that you can fool a biometric scanner. So once you're compromised for the rest of your lives. Now, from a human rights perspective, should we accept that situation? I think not. I think privacy rules should ban the use of biometrics because the risks significantly outweigh the rewards of that.
Armen, tech, good, bad, neutral, go.
Human as species are very primitive to create something that's going to be either good or bad. Technology itself is extremely primitive. When there is a virus called Nazism, we create a nuclear atomic weapon and then we drop it on people trying to eliminate that virus. And then when Ebola breaks out, we come together and we create another vaccine to kill off Ebola. It's circumstantial to feel that humans can design, in the current form, that can design technology that's going to be ethical, moral. We went to Africa, we uprooted millions of people. We brought them to a new continent and we turned them into slaves, and for hundreds of years that was ethical and moral. We boarded ships, we went to a new continent, we killed off tens of millions of people, took their lands, took their identity, still have their identities, and now have borders. We call them nation states, and we call them ethical and moral. Until 1920, women were not able to vote in the United States. Until the 1800s, they were looked upon as subjects, as property, and that was ethical and moral. If Hitler won the World War II, we would have probably all speak German right now and thought Hitler was a true genius. The same way we look at Julius Caesar, a true genius, because the Western civilization is built on Roman Empire. But I promise you, he didn't just march into these lands and they opened the door and said, "You're welcome." These are critical things to look upon, not from the surface, not how you or how we look at it today. Our thinking changed. We like to think that we mature as species. I want to say we like to think of it, yet last 40 years we killed off 60% of all living organisms on the planet. We're probably the worst virus on this planet than any other virus in the history of virus. And we act like a virus, guys. We're killing off the Earth, and now we're finding ways to go to Mars and to other planets because we feel that, and that's what virus does, right? When it kills off the host, it looks for the new one. So talking about ethics and morals and technology, I think it's extremely primitive. I think we don't understand it. Imagine if humanity had the power of technology in 15th century, and then it built that blacks are second-class citizens technology. I want you to know that. And technology from that point on said, this is what's ethical. we gotta enslave the second-class humans, because it's the will of God that white man is the privileged human, and the black man does not have the same rights. I can go on, but I really, I mean, this is the group. I have a great deal of respect for every single one of you sitting in this group. And the only thing I'm asking you is to think a bit broader, to think a bit deeper, and don't think 2019, and don't think that we are the cleverest, the smartest. Think that you're really primitive, because you are.
A great segue to open it up for questions from the floor. All right, so we see one back there, and perhaps we can also hand off another mic to another mic runner. Thank you. We could, I just didn't see more hands yet, so we'll take this one and then watch them.
Thank you for a very thoughtful panel. Sort of this discussion about technology reminds me of Kentaro Tayoma's comment in Geek Heresy, where he talks about the laws of amplification. And, technology will essentially amplify what humans are wired to do. And, if you want to do good with it, you'll do good with it. If you want to do bad, you will. A question for the panel, and Megha, maybe I can request you to start. Is consent dead? Is consent relevant? There are two schools of thought, and there's a raging debate in India right now because the data privacy bill is in Parliament. And there are folks that say, look, consent has been meaningless for a while now. We're all signing on these reams of agreements that we're not reading, and maybe there should be a fiduciary responsibility to this. So one of our legal experts, Rahul Mathan, has written a book, Data Privacy 3.0, which is, his articles often published in Nikhil's Media Nama platform. And Rahul says, you have to put a fiduciary obligation on folks, because consent is not going to be enough. In healthcare, if you suggested that consent was frivolous and that it wasn't necessary, you would have all researchers and bioethicists up in arms. And yet, the technology companies will push back and say, if you have a consent-heavy platform, will not make any progress. To sort of illustrate this with an example, a few years ago, if we were told that Google is, quote-unquote, reading our emails, we'd all freak out. Now, if my airline itinerary is not populated into my iCal, I'm really irritated, right? So social mores change, but these have really dark ramifications, as a couple of you highlighted. So just your comments on consent, and where are we heading with this?
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. I'll take it just in a bit of a different direction. Yeah, I mean, I think that this point, like, is consent dead? It's a pretty good one, because a lot of these new surveillance technologies, like consent, it's not that consent is dead. It's just, first of all, nobody asked you, and second of all, there's no way to meaningfully ask you, right? So, like, for instance, we did a story recently about the cameras that are in Times Square in New York, and how it's possible to map a person's movement using just these cameras, which has feeds. They have feeds that you can just stream online, like any of us can just stream them online, and by using people's Instagram stories that they had sort of thoughtlessly posted. And we followed up like half a dozen people around Times Square, like with using like zero specialized technology. And the thing about that is, like, I called the company that puts the cameras there. It's a very like well-meaning tourism company called EarthCam, and they offer these products because people can't access those locations, right? Like, if I'm disabled, if I live really far away, maybe I want to see what Times Square looks like, right? Sounds nice, but the thing is, like, you don't know that you're being filmed, right? And like EarthCam says, like, oh, well, sometimes we put a little sign up that says, like, smile, you're on an EarthCam, but you have to get close enough to the sign to be able to read it. The thing is, being filmed all the time in public spaces, especially when there's an automated way to track where you're going and who you are, is tantamount to a search. That's a search, and you're not under suspicion of having done anything wrong, right? So that's a kind of like fundamentally different way to think about search than we have previously with other technologies. And like, if you really think about it, it's very hard to get to a solution where you have meaningful consent, like from the people that are actually, being filmed in these public spaces, because there's no way to opt out of it unless you just don't leave your house. And even if you live in a place like a suburb, for instance, everybody here knows what Ring is, right? Like when we have cameras like on our doors to spot packages, I mean, that's another form of video surveillance that's sort of always around. So I think we have to sort of, as a society, just like reevaluate the way that we think about consent and, what we will consider to be meaningful consent.
So the power of consent lies in the lack of consent. And so if you had the power to not give your consent, it means people shouldn't be able to track you. Rahul's an old friend, and we have agreed to disagree on this. I don't think consent has failed because you can still choose not to give consent to something. There are instances with data brokerages where the terms and conditions and even with many apps, the terms and conditions are so, but the implications of what you're giving your data for are so unclear that invariably your privacy gets violated. And that's why I said we have a global market failure in privacy. But the right to not say yes is very, very important. We can't do away with consent. So we have to regulate to ensure that consent remains. And we have to regulate for harmful usage and for usage without consent. So we're at the beginning of that debate as well. The norms are still being figured out. The GDPR has the first step in that direction with trying to articulate for easier notifications so that users can understand what they're signing up for. And I think it has to be improved. We have to find a way. The way I look at this is, I don't believe that we can't find a way. Changes are going to be incremental, improvements are going to be incremental, and we have to keep at it.
So in the interest of time, we just have 10 minutes left. I think it'd be fun to batch questions. So please raise your hand if you have a question. All right, so we've got 1, 2, no more questions. This is a very, 3, thank you at the back. Okay, so mic runners are somewhere. Great, get started. We'll go there, and then there.
Hi. Given that individual consumers have no time or power, that countries, individual nation states are more motivated to maintain power, that platforms are motivated to continue to grow at all costs, and the United Nations has no teeth, who would be your ideal regulator in the brave new world?
Question 2.
Okay, thank you for the speaker and thank you for the presentation that you delivered. But the question now that I would like to ask is, what individuals can do? I mean, like Google has been around for 20 years and we've been expected, and every day they get more data about us. And for sure, the internet cannot always be trusted with our data because, Facebook and Cambridge Analytica issues. What kind of power that actually individuals can do? I mean, with GDPR as well, we know that we have legitimate interests that basically can collect our data, can process our data without even obtaining our consent. The basic question is like, what individual like us can do?
All right, who should regulate what individuals can do? And the third question back there.
Oh, yeah. I'll start with a quick comment, which is being responsible for one tech platform. I can say that without things like GDPR, we would not be focused on providing easy ways for people to opt out, nor providing things like the opportunity for people to request data access or the data that we store to be deleted. So I wonder if you have any comments or thoughts on what we can do to further this, because personally, both as a person responsible and as an individual consumer and user, I think it's in the interest of the end user.
Okay, so should we start at the top and then?
I want to answer all three, so.
Okay, that's okay. We'll start with the first one. Who's your ideal regulator?
So for me, the ideal regulator has to be the United Nations, and we have to give them teeth because effectively these are international norms that have to be figured out. So just for example, between December 2nd and 4th, there is an open-ended working group meeting which is going to look at cyber warfare and the norms that countries need to have to ensure that their territories are not used for cyber warfare. So the problems that we have are many. We have to slice them into individual problems and look at the relevant stakeholders for solutions and define norms. All of it can't be solved in one go. And we have to create global norms, because especially for issues like taxation, it's one of the reasons why all countries want to do data localization. This has to be solved at a global level. I mean, Apple's only paying, 2% tax in the US? The US also has a problem with Apple in that context, right? And Ireland and Luxembourg and a bunch of other countries are essentially benefiting from it. But the countries where they're operating are not necessarily benefiting from the money that they're taking from them.
Armen, do you have an ideal regulator?
I would say the least damaging ones would be a combination between a multinational institution, sovereign states, and private sector. It's, trusting that one entity is going to do justice on policy is not fair to that sovereign state or to that multinational. I mean, it's just a bunch of people, right? Like you and I. Why would they know any better? And sometimes we put too much trust in these entities, because we look at them as unitary objects, like United States, one unit. No, you change from Obama to Trump, you get this. So it's not it's like one unit. It's just a bunch of individuals. So I think having a consortium of sort would be probably the least damaging. But ideal, your expectations are probably somewhere that are completely unrealistic to have ideal policy. Because remember, and I don't mean to steer things, but it's important to really understand that policy is not really up to an individual either. You have religions you have to deal with. You have conventions you have to deal with, and something that you may think is policy-wise is smart for human rights or for this, but then you have religious restrictions that you have to take into consideration because you're dealing with, remember, very primitive humans. So when it comes to that, then there is not an ideal situation. It's just you got to say what's the least damaging one for us to be moving forward until maybe hopefully we create technology that is much smarter than us.
Want to go for it? Or do you want to talk about the power of the individual today?
I'll try to lump them both in, I guess. I guess I'll just add to what's already been said about regulation. I do think that this is not regulation, but I think that there is a lot that companies can do either in aggregate or individually to just act in more responsible manners. We saw this with Facebook last year, right? Like there was a string of things that happened to Facebook, both here in the U.S. and around in Asia and like issues in Myanmar and all that stuff. And Facebook hasn't completely solved all of those problems, but it's recognized those problems and it's taking steps to take responsibility for some of that stuff. Thermo Fisher, in the example that I just mentioned, like after it took a year, but they stopped selling that product in China, right? So I genuinely think that most executives at Silicon Valley tech companies don't want their products to be used in really harmful ways. But it's a matter of sort of recognizing that there is a responsibility for these outcomes and that companies can sort of make pledges to, I guess, at least mitigate some of these harmful impacts. I think that can be really helpful. As far as what individuals can do, I mean, it's a really, really hard question. There's a lot of brain power and also money and energy in this room. And I think that one really good thing that people can do is build privacy-first alternatives to a lot of these platforms. There already are the person who asked that question asked about Google. There are search engines that you can use that are frankly not as good as Google, but that don't track you. It's very difficult to live a life that in 2019 where you're not being tracked in some way. But I have friends that do it. These are people who live in hiding and stuff like that. It's possible to do. I think for most of us, being normal people, people, I think the best thing that we can do is sort of protect ourselves and sort of, try to mitigate some of these impacts.
So at the back, you also had your hand up. Did you want to add to your question?
If I could comment about what Megha, you just mentioned about Facebook. If I could share one anecdote, it was a couple months ago, a recruiter reached out to me from Facebook asking if I was interested in interviewing for a job. This particular one was on their social impact team, looking to make a case for how data that they collect is being used for good. And so I said, okay, great. I talked to the hiring manager, and I found out that they were the only person on the team. So to me, that was surprising because it's a company of how many thousands of employees, and they only have a team of one that's trying to make a case, as in his words were specifically, to show the public that we're using data for good.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'll just say, sorry, I'll say very quickly. Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating anecdote. I think it speaks to something. I don't want this to become like a Let's Bash Facebook panel. It's not about Facebook. But I do feel that this speaks to like something that I've definitely noticed in my reporting on tech platforms, which is that tech platforms will have people that are looking at these trends, like especially in the developing world, like especially in like fragile societies and stuff like that. And they'll have like very smart like policy people that are there, like talking to people and stuff like that. But in the end, these people are often like completely disempowered, and they're not actually able to successfully advocate for and like make the changes that they might think is right or might have gathered the information to be able to do. So I think that's something that tech companies can probably do better, is just to empower people who are not, just building the products, empower people that are looking at like all of these issues together.
So I would just want to respond to that. Platforms are in the business of increasing fragmentation so that each user has very little negotiating power and monetizing their aggregation. The only way that you can hold platforms accountable is by voting with your feet, which is to step out of them. One example from about 3 weeks ago, many liberal Twitter users from India have switched to Mastodon, including me. Many publications have also switched because Twitter has been banning or shadow banning or censoring liberal Indian users on Twitter. And so we're voting with our feet effectively. And Twitter did issue a statement saying that they're fair, et cetera, et cetera. But really, like I said earlier, you can't depend on the benevolence of platforms to ensure your rights. To the question about what we can do from a platform perspective to protect privacy, I think the most important and most powerful tool we'll have is the ability to delete our entire history on a platform. That also helps ensure that we're not badly targeted by AI, and we can start over. The problem is at this point in time, even if you delete you can't delete the entire history, you can just shut down your account, and you don't know whether they delete your history or not then. Right? And they may be tracking you in other ways. Facebook has a history of tracking people, even those who are not on the platform. So norms still have to be created around what's acceptable and what's not, and regulation is bound to follow there.
I hate to cut off a good conversation, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I'll give the last comment to Armen here, and I want to thank everybody for joining us for the session. Last comment?
Oh boy, you really want more? Well, I think all of these discussions are important, and what my fellow friends here are speaking about data privacy and individuals getting involved and protecting data. I think for the current where we are, this is very critical, this is very important, so I completely endorse all of these steps that need to be taken I think for us individuals to be smart. But also think, what is that future is going to look like, guys? I think don't forget about that, because if the minute you take your eyes off of it, then you'll have another Google. There was a question, it's like what we can do as individuals because there are Googles. And remember, 20 years ago, there was no Google, and there were, huge companies, and Google came in and established its footprint. Establish yours.
And with that, thank you so much.